Victor Kingsley was born into wealth, his lineage rooted deep in the oil fields of the early 20th century. The Kingsley family had made their fortune by drilling into the earth, extracting the lifeblood of the modern world. Victor, the heir apparent, was groomed from an early age to inherit not just his family's money, but its power and legacy. As a child, he attended the finest schools, mingled with the children of other wealthy families, and was taught that nothing, absolutely nothing, was out of reach for someone with his last name. But despite the polished veneer of his life, Victor was hollow inside. His childhood, while privileged, was devoid of warmth. His parents were distant, more interested in expanding their empire than in nurturing their son. They were absent figures, figures of authority and control, but never affection. From an early age, Victor learned that the world could be conquered through sheer will and wealth, but he also realized that the more he gained, the lonelier he became. The older he got, the more he found himself surrounded by people who wanted something from him, never truly understanding him, never caring for him. At 25, fresh out of Harvard Business School, Victor could have easily slipped into his family's real estate empire. But he wanted more. He wanted to build something for himself, a legacy that bore his name alone. His ambition led him to a rundown apartment complex in downtown Los Angeles, a far cry from the luxury of his Malibu mansion, but to Victor, it was an opportunity, a diamond in the rough. Where others saw decay, he saw potential. He poured money into renovations, transforming the crumbling building into a chic urban haven. Then, with a sharp, ruthless precision, he raised the rents and flipped the property for a staggering profit. This was his modus operandi, a business strategy that saw others crushed beneath his ambition. Over the next few decades, Victor expanded his empire, making Kingsley Real Estate one of the most formidable names on the West Coast. His business acumen was unmatched, and his reputation was one of both reverence and fear. He had a knack for taking small properties and turning them into cash cows. He offered small-time owners handsome sums, and if they didn't take it? Well, there were always other methods: threats, pressure, persuasion. His employees were loyal, but they feared him. They knew that perfection was not an option, it was a requirement. Yet, as his wealth grew, so did his emptiness. No matter how many properties he acquired, no matter how many luxury cars he drove, no matter how many bottles of rare wine filled his cellar, he couldn't escape the gnawing loneliness that followed him everywhere. His first marriage to Clara Montgomery had ended in a bitter divorce after 10 years, with Clara citing his workaholic tendencies and emotional unavailability. His second marriage, to Sophie Albright, a former model, lasted barely 2 years before it crumbled under the weight of his neglect. She left with a hefty divorce settlement, leaving Victor to lick his wounds in the solitude of his mansion, the walls closing in on him. He swore off marriage for good, preferring instead to date a string of younger women, women who sought out the lifestyle he could provide but never offered anything in return beyond their company. But even they could not fill the void inside him. At 60 years old, Victor was more successful than ever, but more isolated than ever. His mind began to turn inward, to question the choices he had made. Was all of this worth it? The money? The power? The women? It was then, in the solitude of his mansion, that he first saw her. Her name was Isabella Lancaster, and from the moment their eyes met, Victor knew his life would change forever. The moment he laid eyes on her, young, beautiful, and with a spark of ambition in her eyes, he was entranced. But what he didn't realize was that in his pursuit of Isabella, he was setting into motion a chain of events that would lead to his downfall and forever tarnish the Kingsley name he had fought so hard to build. Isabella Lancaster had always known hardship. Born in the small town of Oak Ridge, Oregon, her early life was shaped by scarcity. Her mother, Lila, worked tirelessly as a waitress at the local diner, just scraping by to provide for Isabella and her younger brother. They lived in a modest house at the edge of town, where the paint was peeling, and the grass had long since died. The world outside, with its promises of wealth and opportunity, seemed like a distant dream, something unattainable for someone like Isabella, someone born without privilege. Her father, Thomas Lancaster, had disappeared before she was born, leaving behind nothing but a name on a birth certificate and a bitter hole in Isabella's heart. She had never known him, but his absence left a mark on her soul that never quite healed. Lila did her best to raise her children alone, but the men who came in and out of her life only took more from her, more time, more energy, more of the spirit that made her the warm, loving woman she once was. Isabella watched as her mother's once vibrant personality dulled with each failed relationship, each disappointment. Despite these challenges, Isabella excelled in school. She was always the brightest in her class, the one who could answer every question with ease, the one who stayed late to help other students. Her natural talent for performance quickly became apparent. By the time she reached high school, she was the star of every school play, captivating the audience with her dramatic flair. Teachers adored her and encouraged her to dream big: college, Hollywood, the stage. They saw in her the potential for greatness, a brilliance that could one day break free from Oak Ridge's suffocating limits. But as high school graduation loomed, reality hit her hard. There was no money for college. Her family had nothing saved up, no financial cushion to fall back on. She had no connections, no safety net, no rich uncle to help fund her dreams. Isabella realized, with a heavy heart, that if she wanted to escape the cycle of poverty that had defined her life, she would have to do it on her own. It was at that moment of realization that Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She packed her things into a small backpack, withdrew the last bit of money she had saved from working part-time at the local movie theater, and bought a bus ticket to Los Angeles, the city of dreams. She had no plan, no idea how she would make it, but the fire to succeed burned fiercely within her. She was determined to build a life outside Oak Ridge, to become something more than just the girl from a small town. The journey was long, and when Isabella finally arrived in Los Angeles, she was overwhelmed. The city that had once felt like a beacon of hope now seemed like an imposing maze of bright lights and indifferent strangers. The dream she had built in her head, full of red carpets and movie premieres, seemed a million miles away from the reality she now faced. She found a small, run-down apartment in a neighborhood that was far from glamorous. The rent ate up most of the money she had, and what was left barely covered food and transportation. Isabella took a job as a waitress at a trendy cafe in West Hollywood, hoping that one day her big break would come. But as the weeks turned into months, her optimism began to fade. She spent her days serving overpriced lattes and her nights walking the streets of Los Angeles, wondering if she had made a mistake, if her dreams of stardom were just that, dreams. The auditions were few and far between, and when they came, they felt like hollow opportunities. It seemed like the industry was more interested in who you knew than in what you could do. She was on the verge of giving up and returning home when fate intervened. One evening, after another long shift at the cafe, Isabella cleared a table where a group of young women were sitting. They were laughing and talking in hushed tones about their arrangements, about the things their daddies had bought them, luxury bags, designer clothes, all paid for by older, wealthy men. Intrigued but hesitant, Isabella listened in, her curiosity piqued. After the women left, Isabella struck up a conversation with one of them, a glamorous woman named Chloe who seemed to live in a different world altogether. Chloe explained the world of sugar dating, how young, beautiful women could meet older, wealthy men who would provide them with financial support in exchange for companionship and intimacy. At first, Isabella was repulsed by the idea. It felt wrong, like the kind of life her mother had led, always dependent on men. But as Chloe shared more, about the gifts, the lavish apartments, the luxurious trips, it became harder to dismiss. The idea gnawed at Isabella. The opportunity to escape her financial struggles, to live a life of luxury, seemed too good to ignore. Chloe encouraged her to create a profile on an exclusive sugar dating website, offering her tips on choosing the right photos, writing a captivating bio, and making a strong first impression. It felt like a gamble, but Isabella was desperate. She wanted to escape, to rise above the life she had known. Within days of setting up her profile, Isabella's inbox was flooded with messages from potential sugar daddies. But one message stood out, a simple invitation to a charity gala hosted by none other than Victor Kingsley, a name she recognized instantly. He was a real estate mogul, a man of immense wealth and influence. The invitation promised a night of glamour and opportunity, a chance to meet someone who could change her life. Isabella, despite her reservations, accepted the invitation. She had nothing left to lose. The night of the gala, she arrived at a grand venue in Beverly Hills, her borrowed gown barely fitting, her nerves a swirling mess inside her. As she entered the ballroom, she felt a sense of awe and trepidation. The room glittered with chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of perfume and expensive wine. And then, she saw him. Victor Kingsley. Distinguished, handsome, and undeniably powerful, he made his way across the room toward her, a predatory gleam in his eye. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment that would change everything. Victor extended his hand, his grip firm and confident. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss Lancaster," he said with a smile that made her feel both flattered and uncertain. His words, his touch, sent a shiver through her spine, and in that moment, Isabella knew, her life, her destiny, was about to take a turn she could never have imagined. The whirlwind of their courtship began that night. Victor showered her with gifts, with experiences that most could only dream of. But Isabella, despite the allure of it all, couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper, something darker, was lurking beneath the surface. As their relationship grew, she would soon realize that the price for all this luxury and attention might be more than she was willing to pay. And so began the story of Isabella Lancaster and Victor Kingsley, a story that would unravel with twists and turns, a story of power, obsession, and ultimately, betrayal. The night of the gala was a dream come true for Isabella. She had never been to such an extravagant event, and the opulence of the evening was almost overwhelming. As she entered the grand ballroom at Beverly Hills, she was surrounded by towering chandeliers, men and women dressed in their finest attire, and the soft hum of laughter and conversation. It felt as if she had stepped into a world she had only seen on TV, a world where wealth and power flowed freely, and everyone in the room seemed to have a place. Isabella's heart raced, her borrowed gown clinging to her body as she nervously adjusted the straps, hoping she looked the part. She had never felt so out of place. She was a small-town girl, lost in a sea of millionaires and influencers. Her hands trembled as she clutched her clutch, trying to calm the storm of nerves churning inside her. She scanned the room, feeling utterly insignificant compared to the well-heeled guests who seemed to float effortlessly in their world of luxury. And then, her eyes locked with his. Victor Kingsley. He stood across the room, his tall frame commanding attention the moment he stepped into view. His tailored suit, immaculate and sharp, hugged his broad shoulders. His salt and pepper hair added a distinguished edge to his handsome face, and his intense, calculating gaze swept over the room, taking in the scene. He was the epitome of power and success, a man who had built his empire from the ground up, a man whose very presence seemed to demand respect. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard of him, of course. Who hadn't? Victor Kingsley was one of the wealthiest men in Los Angeles, a real estate mogul whose name was synonymous with luxury and success. But seeing him in person, so close, so real, was different. He exuded an aura of dominance that she couldn't help but be drawn to, even though something deep inside her whispered a warning. Victor's eyes flicked toward her, and in that instant, the crowded ballroom seemed to fade away. Time itself slowed. His gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She had no idea what he saw in her, this young woman from a small town, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. It was the look of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. And in that moment, he wanted her. He approached her with a measured, confident stride, his movements fluid and purposeful. As he reached her, he smiled, a smile that was both charming and unsettling. His hand extended toward hers, and when she placed her fingers in his, she felt an electric charge shoot through her body. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss Lancaster," Victor said, his voice low and smooth, carrying an air of both power and politeness. He held her hand firmly, as if marking his territory, and Isabella felt a strange, almost involuntary shiver run down her spine. "Mr. Kingsley," she managed, her voice soft but steady, despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Her heart raced faster than before, but she couldn't pull away. There was something about him that made her feel alive, something magnetic, something dangerous. He smiled again, his eyes gleaming with a quiet understanding. "Please, call me Victor," he said, guiding her gently through the crowd. His touch lingered on the small of her back, a subtle claim that made her pulse quicken. As they moved deeper into the ballroom, Isabella felt like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The music swirled around them, and the laughter of the other guests seemed to fade into the background as Victor led her to a secluded corner of the room, where a small group of influential people were gathered. He introduced her with ease, his words wrapping around her like a silken thread, drawing her into his web. But it was his eyes that kept drawing her in, his gaze, intense and unwavering, watching her with a calculating sharpness that made her feel like she was being weighed and measured. Isabella tried to keep her composure, but there was something unnerving about how he seemed to see straight through her. She wasn't just a woman at a party. To Victor Kingsley, she was something more, something he could possess. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted. They spoke about her dreams, her aspirations, and the challenges she had faced to get to Los Angeles. Victor listened intently, hanging on every word, his gaze never wavering. She found herself opening up to him in a way she hadn't with anyone else. There was something about his presence, about the way he made her feel like the most important person in the room, that made her feel safe, even though she knew, deep down, that she was treading dangerous ground. "I know this city," Victor said after a while, his voice smooth, confident. "And I know the right people. I could help you, Isabella. I could introduce you to the right people, the people who could get you where you want to go." His words were like honey, dripping with promises of success, of a life she had only ever dreamed of. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She had dreamed of this moment, of meeting someone who could open doors, who could make things happen. And here he was, offering it all to her. But a small voice in the back of her mind told her to be careful. Nothing came free. There was always a price. Victor leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I believe you have what it takes, Isabella. You just need the right push. A little help to get started." His eyes softened for a brief moment, and then the edge returned. "But nothing in this world is ever truly free. Remember that." Isabella blinked, the weight of his words sinking in. She had heard that before, nothing came without strings attached. But she had no choice. She needed this. She needed his help. What was the harm in accepting an offer from a man like Victor Kingsley? As they continued to talk, the evening passed in a blur of laughter, fine wine, and whispered promises. By the time the gala drew to a close, Isabella was dizzy from the attention, from the intoxicating blend of wealth, power, and charm that Victor had poured over her. When he invited her to dinner the following evening, she didn't hesitate. For the first time since arriving in Los Angeles, Isabella felt like she had found a way out, a way into the life she had always dreamed of. She was ready to embrace it, ready to be swept up in Victor's world, not realizing that in doing so, she was about to lose herself entirely. And so, the story of their relationship began, a whirlwind, a dance of power, seduction, and ambition. But what Isabella didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly have understood, was that with Victor, there was always a price to be paid. The game had just begun. The whirlwind romance with Victor Kingsley had swept Isabella off her feet in ways she never expected. What had started as a chance meeting at a glamorous gala had quickly spiraled into an intense, almost surreal courtship. Every moment she spent with Victor seemed like a step further into a world she had only ever imagined, a world of penthouses, expensive cars, and lavish trips to places she had once only seen in magazines. At first, she reveled in the attention, in the gifts, and the promises of a future where she would be somebody important, somebody admired. Victor was everything she had ever wanted in a man, charming, intelligent, and powerful. He was a man who could make dreams come true with a snap of his fingers. And to Isabella, his attention felt like validation, the kind she had longed for, growing up in a small town where the world seemed so far away. He made her feel like she was the center of his universe, a star in a story that had just begun. But as the days turned into weeks, cracks began to form in the seemingly perfect facade. It started with small things. Victor would insist on picking her up, making sure she was always available when he called, questioning her plans, her friendships, and especially her interactions with other men. At first, Isabella brushed it off as care for her well-being. He was just being protective, she thought. He was just ensuring that no one else would take what was his. But slowly, these small actions began to wear on her, planting seeds of doubt in her mind. She had always prided herself on her independence. She was the girl who had left Oak Ridge with nothing but a backpack full of dreams and a head full of ambition. She had made it to Los Angeles on her own, had scraped together every penny, and had fought for every opportunity. She had never relied on anyone but herself, until now. It wasn't just Victor's growing possessiveness that unsettled her. It was the way his generosity felt like a leash, tightening around her with each new gift. The luxury apartment in West Hollywood, the designer clothes, the brand new sports car, it all felt like it came with invisible strings. What had started as a fairy tale was beginning to feel more like a trap. One evening, after yet another lavish dinner with Victor, Isabella found herself alone in her new apartment, staring at the pile of designer clothes Victor had bought for her. The walk-in closet was full of beautiful, expensive dresses, shoes, and accessories, things she had never imagined owning. But as she looked at the garments, something inside her shifted. She was no longer sure if she was living a dream, or if she was simply living in a gilded cage. She had always wanted success, but not like this. Not at the expense of her sense of self. Was this really the life she had imagined for herself when she boarded that bus to Los Angeles all those months ago? Was this the price she had to pay to escape Oak Ridge? To escape her mother's life, a life where love had always been transactional, dependent on men and their whims? The unease grew when Victor began to ask more intrusive questions. He wanted to know where she was every second of the day. If she went out with friends, he wanted to know who they were and what they talked about. If she spent time with other men, whether professionally or casually, he would react with cool indifference that masked a simmering jealousy beneath. He dismissed her career aspirations, made her feel as though her dreams were secondary to his desires. One evening, after a particularly heated argument where Victor had criticized her for spending too much time with a male colleague, Isabella finally broke. She stormed out of the apartment, leaving behind the extravagant lifestyle that had once felt like a dream but was now beginning to suffocate her. As she walked through the streets of West Hollywood, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and anger. Was she simply another beautiful woman in Victor's collection, a trophy to be paraded around at events and kept at arm's length when he needed her? Or did he truly care for her? And if he did, why did she feel so trapped, so invisible? It was in that moment of clarity, standing on the sidewalk beneath the neon lights of the city, that Isabella realized she was losing herself. The woman who had come to Los Angeles with nothing but a dream had slowly become a version of herself that she barely recognized. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, she had started to lose her independence, her voice, and her sense of who she was. In Victor's world, she had become another object to be owned, another conquest to be controlled. She needed a way out, but she wasn't sure how to get there. The fear of losing everything, the lavish life she had come to depend on, the security Victor had provided, was paralyzing. What would she have left if she walked away? Would she end up back in Oak Ridge, serving tables again, wondering where it all went wrong? The answer, however, became clear when she met Ethan Brooks. Ethan was everything Victor wasn't. He was fresh-faced, enthusiastic, and untainted by the glamour of Hollywood. He was a film student, a passionate dreamer who spoke with excitement about his projects, his ideas, and his vision of the future. When they met at a cafe in West Hollywood, Isabella felt a spark she hadn't felt in months. He saw her as an equal, not as a tool for his own success. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt truly seen, not as a trophy or a possession, but as herself. They spent hours talking, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Ethan didn't ask about her connection to Victor or about the gifts she had received. He didn't care about her wealth or her social status. He cared about her, her ideas, her dreams, her thoughts. And in that moment, Isabella realized something she had been afraid to admit: she didn't want to be Victor's possession anymore. She wanted to be free. The connection she felt with Ethan was unlike anything she had experienced with Victor. It was genuine, pure, and real. As they parted that evening, Ethan asked for her number, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt a sense of hope. Maybe there was another way out. Maybe there was a life where she could have both love and independence. But as she left the cafe, her phone buzzing with a message from Ethan, her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar, ominous feeling. She knew Victor would be watching. He always was. It wasn't just the life with Victor that she was beginning to question. It was everything she had built her identity around: the fame, the luxury, the need for validation. In the moments she spent with Ethan, Isabella realized that what she truly longed for was something much simpler: freedom, authenticity, and a love that was based on who she truly was, not on what she could offer. But getting out of Victor's grip would not be easy. There was a darkness lurking behind Victor's charm, a darkness that Isabella was only beginning to understand. And as she took her first steps toward freedom, she knew there would be consequences. The question was she ready to face them? Isabella had awoken to the truth, and now, there was no turning back. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. The decision had been made, but as Isabella stood on the precipice of her future, the weight of it threatened to crush her. For weeks, the thought of leaving Victor had lingered in her mind like a shadow. It was a thought she had fought against, buried beneath the layers of wealth, luxury, and the life he had offered her. But now, standing alone in her apartment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Malibu's coastline, the weight of the decision was undeniable. Victor Kingsley had given her everything, everything she had ever dreamed of: the apartment, the designer clothes, the fancy dinners. He had promised her connections, a career in the entertainment industry, the life she had always imagined. But none of that mattered anymore. The price she had paid was too high. She had lost herself. The life she had built on ambition, on dreams, had become a gilded cage, and every new gift, every new promise, had made the walls close in a little more. Isabella had begun to feel like a shadow of herself, a reflection of the woman she used to be. Victor's love, or what he called love, had never been unconditional. It was always tied to control, to manipulation, to the quiet, unspoken threat of losing everything if she stepped out of line. She had become a puppet in his world, and the strings had tightened too much to bear. She longed to be free of him, free of his suffocating grip. But the fear gnawed at her. What would she have left? Without Victor, what would she be? The fame she had started to taste, the possibility of a career she had always dreamed of, would vanish. She had grown accustomed to the lifestyle, luxury, ease, and the adoration that came with being Victor Kingsley's companion. If she left him, she might lose it all. She might end up back where she started, serving coffee at a cafe in West Hollywood, wondering where it all went wrong. But the thought of continuing this charade, of living a life that wasn't hers, was even more unbearable. She had spent her entire life fighting for a better future, for a life where she could choose her own path. How could she continue to sacrifice that for a man who didn't truly see her? Who saw her as an accessory, a beautiful piece to flaunt at parties and business events? One night, after another heated argument with Victor, his jealousy flaring up over a harmless conversation she had had with a colleague, Isabella knew it was time. She couldn't stand it any longer. The relationship had become a battle for control, a struggle where her voice, her independence, had no place. Victor's demands, his threats disguised as concern, had stripped away everything she once valued. She had become nothing more than a trophy, a possession in his eyes. Victor had already started to isolate her from her friends, subtly questioning her loyalty and her choices. It was clear now, he wanted to own her completely. And Isabella realized that if she didn't leave now, she might never be able to. She had to walk away. But walking away from a man like Victor was not going to be easy. The consequences would be severe, and she knew it. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Isabella stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time in weeks, she saw herself clearly, the woman she was, not the image Victor had crafted for her. She had to reclaim her life, her dreams. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Victor would never let her go without a fight. He would try to guilt her, manipulate her, use his power and wealth to force her back into his grasp. But Isabella was determined. She had already made up her mind. With trembling hands, she began to pack a bag, just a few clothes, a few personal items. She had already made the decision to leave the luxury apartment, the life that Victor had built for her. It wasn't hers anymore. She wasn't sure where she would go, but that didn't matter. The moment she stepped out of that door, she would be free. As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed with a message from Victor. He was angry, of course, angry that she had spent the evening out with a colleague, angry that she wasn't answering his calls. She read his message, her chest tightening as she typed a quick reply, "I need space. I need time to think." Her hands shook as she hit send. She knew he wouldn't accept it. He would push back, demand answers, demand that she come back. But this was the only way forward. She had to break free. When Victor arrived at the apartment that evening, the confrontation she had feared came to pass. The moment he stepped through the door, she could see it in his eyes, the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. He wasn't angry at her, not really. He was angry at losing control. Isabella had become something he owned, and the thought of losing her was unbearable. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. He stormed toward her, his voice low and dangerous. "What's this about, Isabella? You think you can just walk away from everything I've given you? Everything we've built together?" Isabella stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not walking away from anything, Victor. I'm walking away from you." The words stung as they left her mouth. But they were the truth. She couldn't deny it any longer. Victor's face twisted with disbelief, then anger. "You're nothing without me. Do you think you'll make it on your own? You'll be back. They all come back." His voice was chilling, but Isabella stood tall, determined not to let his threats or his manipulations break her. "I'm leaving, Victor. And I'm never coming back." She turned away, heading for the door, but Victor grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "You think you can just walk out and leave everything behind? You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." His grip tightened on her wrist, and Isabella winced. But she didn't flinch. She had made up her mind. The fear that had once paralyzed her now faded, replaced by a quiet strength. She was done. With all the courage she could muster, she pulled away from him. "Goodbye, Victor," she said, her voice firm. This is where I walk away." As she left the apartment, the weight of her decision sank in. She had done it. She had chosen herself, chosen her freedom. But as she stepped out into the cool night air, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Victor wouldn't let her go easily. She had no doubt that there would be consequences, threats, maybe even worse. But for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt like she was in control of her own destiny. Victor Kingsley had been a chapter in her life, a dark chapter. But now, she was ready to turn the page. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. And no matter what happened next, Isabella Lancaster was finally free. Victor Kingsley was not a man who took betrayal lightly. The minute Isabella walked out of his life, a darkness descended over him, more profound than anything he had ever experienced before. His wealth, his power, and his success had always been his shield, the thing that kept him insulated from the harsh realities of life. But this loss, was different. It wasn't just the woman who had left him. It was the loss of control, the feeling of vulnerability he couldn't bear. Victor's mind raced, churning with anger, humiliation, and a deep-seated fear that Isabella had moved on without him. She was his, she had always been his. He had given her everything, wealth, opportunities, the kind of life that other women would have killed for. How could she simply walk away? How could she leave him for someone else, for a man like Ethan, someone beneath her? But as the anger festered inside him, so too did the realization that he couldn't let her go. He couldn't let her slip through his fingers without making sure that no one else could ever have her. If he couldn't have her, then no one would. Victor knew that it would take more than just words to bring her back. His charm, his money, his promises, none of it would work. Isabella was too far gone. She had tasted freedom, independence, a life without him, and the thought of her living that life was unbearable. He couldn't let her live out her dreams, especially not with someone like Ethan. He needed something more. He needed her gone. Permanently. Victor's first instinct was to confront Isabella, to beg, to threaten, to manipulate. But he knew her well enough to realize that those tactics wouldn't work. She was stubborn, headstrong, and now, more than ever, determined to escape his grasp. He had lost her once, but he would not lose her again, not if he could help it. No, this time, he would make sure there were no options left for her to return to. As his anger simmered, a thought occurred to him, one that sent a cold shiver through his body. He didn't need to bring her back. He could simply eliminate her from the equation entirely. Victor's empire was built on ruthless ambition, and he had a network of people who owed him favors, people who could make problems disappear without anyone ever knowing. It wasn't difficult for him to track down someone like Damien Cross, a former military operative turned hired gun. Damien was a ghost, a man whose name was only whispered in the dark corners of the criminal world. He was efficient, discreet, and lethal. Victor made the call, his voice calm, businesslike. "It needs to look like an accident. No connection to me, none at all. Make sure no one ever finds out." His instructions were clear, precise, and detached. He wasn't just asking for a favor. He was ordering an execution. The plan was simple. Damien would track Isabella, follow her every move, and wait for the perfect opportunity, an isolated road, a moment of vulnerability. He would make sure the deed was done swiftly and quietly. No one would ever suspect Victor. No one would know it was him who had pulled the strings. The control he once held over her would be regained, and in a way, he could have the last word, the final victory. Isabella would never be able to escape him again. Days passed. Victor went about his life, his face a mask of calm, but inside, a storm raged. Every time he thought about Isabella, about her free, unencumbered life with Ethan, his resolve hardened. He could not allow her to slip from his grasp. If she had chosen to leave him, he would show her just how impossible it was to do so. Finally, the night came. Isabella had a meeting, a callback for a small role in an independent film. It wasn't much, but it was something. She was moving forward, making progress, and it made Victor seethe with jealousy. The thought of her stepping into the world of Hollywood without him, without his guidance, was too much to bear. He learned through his sources that she would be driving alone to the shoot, down a dark stretch of Mulholland Drive, a road known for its sharp turns and steep drops. It was the perfect place for an accident, remote, dangerous, and empty. No one would find her in time. Damien was already in position, watching from the shadows. He knew the area well, and when the time came, he would strike. Victor's mind was filled with thoughts of Isabella, her defiance, her strength, and the betrayal she had dealt him. How dare she leave him? How dare she try to build a life without him? She would pay for that choice. She would pay dearly. Isabella, oblivious to the danger, drove down the winding road, her car a solitary beacon of light in the dark night. She was on her way to the shoot, her thoughts focused on her career, her future. She thought about Ethan, about the possibility of a life with him, free from Victor's suffocating control. But even as she drove, there was a small part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound the hum of her car's engine and the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. She glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a dark SUV trailing her, a sense of unease settling in her stomach. She pressed down on the accelerator, trying to outrun the growing discomfort. But the SUV matched her speed, pulling closer, until she could see the headlights in her mirror, just a little too close for comfort. Before she could react, there was a sudden jolt, a violent hit from behind. Her car fishtailed, and she fought to regain control, but the road was too treacherous. The guardrail, weakened from years of neglect, gave way as her car careened over the edge. The world around her spun wildly, the sound of screeching metal and shattering glass filling her ears. And then, silence. When the car finally came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, Isabella was unconscious, her body battered and broken, the world fading in and out of focus. Damien watched from a distance, ensuring that the job was done. He saw no signs of life in the wreckage, and with a final glance, he drove away, confident that Isabella Lancaster was dead. Back in Malibu, Victor poured himself a drink, his mind at ease. The tension that had been building for days finally began to dissolve, replaced by a strange sense of satisfaction. Isabella was gone. She would never threaten his world again. She would never leave him again. But what Victor didn't know was that the story wasn't over. Isabella, battered and broken, was still alive. Despite the pain, despite the crushing weight of her injuries, she was clinging to life. She crawled from the wreckage, desperate for help, driven by a primal will to survive. She wasn't going to let Victor's grip on her life be the end of her. She wasn't going to die like this, not without a fight. Unbeknownst to Victor, the chain of events that he had set in motion would unravel the darkest secret of all, and the pursuit of revenge would bring him closer to the truth than he could ever have imagined. The consequences of his actions had only just begun. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, the scene of Isabella's crash was already being combed by local authorities. The early morning fog hung thick in the air, cloaking the city in an eerie stillness, and with it, the grim discovery of the wreckage at the bottom of Mulholland Drive. A jogger, following his usual morning route, stumbled upon the mangled car, its shattered windows and twisted metal a horrific sight. He dialed 911, his voice shaking as he reported the crash, knowing there was little hope of finding anyone alive. But against all odds, Isabella was still breathing, barely conscious and fighting for her life. As paramedics arrived at the scene, they found her struggling to move, bloodied and battered, her body bruised beyond recognition. Her breath was shallow, her consciousness flickering between moments of agony and fading darkness. They quickly stabilized her and rushed her to the hospital, where doctors immediately put her into a medically induced coma to give her the best chance at survival. Meanwhile, the news of the crash spread quickly, and Isabella's name, already whispered across Hollywood circles due to her brief connection with the infamous real estate mogul, Victor Kingsley, appeared in the headlines. The details of the crash were suspicious from the start: the damaged guardrail, the lack of any other vehicles, the seemingly random nature of the accident. To the police, this wasn't just an ordinary car accident. Something didn't add up. Detective Harper of the LAPD, known for her sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of the truth, was called in to lead the investigation. She wasn't one to take things at face value, and as soon as she saw the scene of the crash, her gut told her this was no ordinary accident. The precise nature of the damage to the car, the lack of skid marks, and the way the guardrail had been broken all pointed to something more sinister. It looked like a carefully orchestrated hit, a targeted attack, and possibly even murder. Isabella was still unconscious, but Detective Harper knew that the only way to solve this case would be to find out exactly what had happened in the days leading up to the crash. The young woman, though fighting for her life, had been an enigma to Harper, and every new detail added more layers to the mystery. She began by interviewing those closest to Isabella, friends, colleagues, and anyone who might have seen her before the accident. The breakthrough came when Harper learned about Isabella's connection to Victor Kingsley. The whispers of their relationship had been circling Hollywood for months, but they were more than rumors. They were clues that pointed directly to a man who had the resources, the motive, and the power to orchestrate such an act. Victor's name kept coming up in the context of the crash, and Harper began to connect the dots. The wealthy mogul, who had once been so enamored with Isabella, had since become possessive and controlling. His jealousy had reached dangerous heights, and now, it seemed, it had led him to the darkest of actions. Harper's first stop was to question Ethan Brooks, the young film student Isabella had been seen with shortly before the accident. He had become an important part of Isabella's life, and his concern for her welfare seemed genuine. Ethan was distraught when he learned that Isabella was in critical condition, but Harper noticed a strange detail during their conversation. Ethan mentioned that Isabella had been afraid of Victor, that she had feared he might do something drastic. Her fear, he revealed, had come from Victor's increasing jealousy, his attempts to control her every move, and his repeated threats to ruin her career if she left him. Harper's instincts were starting to align. She had the motive, but she still lacked the hard evidence to make her case. She knew that Victor was connected to the crash, but proving it would be another matter entirely. The key would lie in the timeline, the events leading up to that fateful night. Harper ordered a full investigation into Victor Kingsley's movements, looking for anything that could tie him to the crash. It didn't take long for the evidence to start mounting. Harper uncovered phone records that placed Victor's personal cell near Mulholland Drive the night of the crash. Although Victor had told the police that he had been at home all evening, surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed his car on the same stretch of road as Isabella's just hours before the crash. The pieces were falling into place. Harper pushed forward with her investigation, uncovering more troubling evidence: a large, unexplained withdrawal from Victor's offshore account just days before the crash, a transaction that was linked to a private investigator hired to track Isabella's every move. The connection between Victor and the events leading up to the crash was becoming clearer with each passing day. But it was the tip from an unexpected source that would finally break the case wide open. A small-time drug dealer, who had recently been arrested on unrelated charges, overheard a conversation in a bar about a hit ordered by a wealthy man on his younger girlfriend. The description of the hitman, a man known only as Damien Cross, matched the details of the assassin Harper had been investigating. Damien Cross had been a shadow, a ghost, but now, his name was attached to the most damning part of the case. With this new information, Harper's team began to track down Cross. They found a trail of his movements, leading them to a safe house in the desert where he had been hiding out. The evidence against Victor Kingsley was beginning to accumulate, but Harper needed more. She needed Cross to crack, to admit that Victor was the one who had orchestrated the attack on Isabella. It wasn't long before Cross was captured. Under intense interrogation, he finally broke. Damian Cross revealed everything: how Victor Kingsley had hired him to eliminate Isabella, how he had tracked her every move, and how the crash was no accident, it had been planned down to the smallest detail. Cross's confession provided the final piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't just his word that would seal Victor's fate. Harper now had the evidence she needed: phone records, financial transactions, and the confession from the hitman himself. Victor Kingsley was arrested and charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. His world, once built on power and fear, crumbled in an instant. The public, once enamored by his wealth and charm, was now horrified by the lengths he had gone to keep Isabella under his control. Isabella, still recovering in the hospital, was kept in a medically induced coma for weeks, but as she slowly woke, her memory began to return in pieces. The first thing she remembered was Victor's face, the look in his eyes when she had left him. She had felt a shiver run down her spine then, and now, with the help of Detective Harper, she would come to understand the depth of his obsession with her. Isabella would survive, and through the darkness of her ordeal, she would find a way to rebuild her life. But it would not be without scars, scars that would remind her of the price of freedom and the high cost of betrayal. As for Victor Kingsley, he would face the consequences of his actions, paying for the lives he had destroyed in his relentless pursuit of power and control. Justice had been served, but it was a bitter victory, one that left Isabella with the painful reminder that some people's need for control knows no bounds. Harper watched as the pieces of the case fell into place, knowing that the truth had finally come to light. But she also knew that for Isabella, the real battle was just beginning, reclaiming her life and finding peace after everything she had endured. The aftermath of Victor Kingsley's arrest sent shockwaves through the world that once admired him. The mighty mogul, who had built his empire on a foundation of wealth and fear, was now a shadow of his former self. His trial was a media frenzy, with every new revelation of his dark deeds making headlines. The public, once enamored with his lavish lifestyle, now recoiled at the truth of his actions. The tale of his obsession with Isabella, his manipulation, and his willingness to go to unimaginable lengths to control her became a cautionary story for all who had once admired him. For Isabella, the road to healing was long and fraught with difficulty. Though the physical wounds of the crash would eventually heal, the emotional scars would take much longer to fade. She had been through the fire, tested in ways she never thought possible. But as the weeks and months passed, she found herself surrounded by people who truly cared for her: Ethan, her friends, and a few new allies she met along the way. They became her support system, reminding her that she was more than the woman who had once been caught in the web of a powerful man's obsession. She was a survivor, and that in itself made her stronger. The journey wasn't easy. Isabella had to face the trauma of her past, the lies she had told herself, the person she had become in the shadow of Victor's manipulation. The luxury, the fame, the promise of success, all of it had come at a cost. But she knew that the hardest part was behind her now. She was free. For the first time in a long time, she was living her life on her terms. In the weeks following Victor's conviction, Isabella began to rebuild her career. She returned to acting, but this time, it was different. She wasn't chasing fame for the sake of validation. She was doing it for herself. The roles she took on were small, but they were meaningful. She knew that true success wasn't about the red carpets or the glamorous parties. It was about finding peace within herself and doing what she loved, without anyone else pulling the strings. Ethan, who had been by her side through everything, proved to be a constant source of support. He respected her independence, admired her strength, and loved her for who she was, not for what she could offer him. Together, they forged a quiet, steady relationship built on trust and mutual respect. There were no games, no power plays, just two people who had found each other in a world that could be unforgiving. As for Victor, his empire crumbled in the face of his crimes. His once glorious mansion in Malibu was sold off, and the properties he had acquired through his ruthless tactics were liquidated. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and his name, once revered, became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and obsession. Isabella, though scarred by the events that had unfolded, chose to take control of her future. She was no longer defined by the man who had tried to break her, the man who had sought to possess her. She had learned the hard way that no one, no matter how powerful, how wealthy, had the right to control another person's destiny. The true power lay in choosing to walk away, to reclaim one's autonomy, and to decide who you wanted to be, regardless of what others expected of you. In time, Isabella found peace. She didn't need to look back anymore. Her future was hers to shape, and she was ready to live it on her own terms. As Isabella stood on the precipice of her new life, the truth settled within her. She had fought for her freedom, and while the scars would never fully disappear, they no longer defined her. She had reclaimed her power, and in doing so, she had transformed her past from a prison into a testament to her strength and resilience. The story of Victor and Isabella serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of control and manipulation in relationships. It's a story of survival, self-discovery, and ultimately, freedom. But it also leaves us with important questions. What do you think about Isabella's journey? Was she right to leave everything behind and fight for her freedom? Have you ever felt trapped in a relationship or situation that was controlling? How did you cope, or what would you do differently now, looking back? What message do you take away from Isabella's strength and her ability to rise above her circumstances? We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections. Leave a comment below and let us know how this story resonated with you. Your feedback and insights are always appreciated. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more gripping true crime stories. Let's continue the conversation and keep learning from the real-life journeys of resilience and survival.